Canadian farmer Percy Schmeiser, who's battled the biotech company Monsanto for years. In 1997, Percy and his wife Louise won the Right Livelihood Award for their courage in defending biodiversity and farmers' rights. I spoke with Percy Schmeiser yesterday in Bonn, but first I want to turn to Bertram Verhaag's documentary, Percy Schmeiser, David versus Monsanto.
The pesticide Roundup produced by the multinational concern Monsanto is the most widely sold spray in the world. Monsanto made its canola resistant to Roundup. This means Roundup kills every plant without exception. Only Monsanto's genetically modified canola remains alive.
It was introduced without really much testing being done, and I think even at that time when it was introduced in the middle of the 90s, that even the governments were taken in by what these corporations told what it would do, like increased yields and less chemicals and more nutritious. And I think the governments even believed the corporations.
In 1996, the chemical giant Monsanto introduced its brand of canola into Canada, a brand resistant to the pesticide Roundup. In Schmeiser's region, 3 farmers agreed to plant Monsanto's new GMO canola. Due to a heavy storm during the harvest, freshly cut GMO canola drifted into Percy Schmeiser's fields. His work of 50 years of breeding was destroyed because his harvest was contaminated by Monsanto's seed.
It came like a time bomb, like a shock to me that my seed was ruined through cross-pollination or direct seed drift by a substance, by a seed I didn't want in my land. And so it was very disgusting and hard to take that I had lost something that I worked 50 years on.
Contamination and destruction of his own breed was irrevocably damaging to Percy Schmeiser. But on top of that, Monsanto turned him, the victim, into a culprit.
An excerpt from the documentary Percy Schmeiser, David versus Monsanto. Well, I met Percy Schmeiser yesterday here in Bonn and asked him to talk about this epic struggle he has with the biotech giant Monsanto. It's one of the largest biotech companies in the world.
It started in 1998. When Monsanto laid what they called a patent infringement lawsuit against my wife and myself, and they charged us that we were growing their genetic altered or GMO canola, as we call it in Canada. And that was the beginning of it. And as GMOs were introduced in North America in 1996, so this was 2 years after the introduction.
Explain what a GMO is.
Genetic modified organisms, and what that really means is that they took a gene from another life form, put it into canola, which made it resistant to Monsanto's herbicide Roundup.
And explain what canola is.
Canola is, well, here in most of the parts of the world we call it rapeseed, but canola is an oil-based crop, and primarily it is used for making cooking oil. And the meal from it after it's pressed is good animal feed, both for cattle and for pigs.
And explain how it ended up on your property.
My neighbor had grown it in 1997, and the following year it had through cross-pollination, but at that time we believe it was primarily the contamination came from seeds blown in the wind, transportation by the farmer to the market, to his field, and from his field to his granaries.
So if you didn't buy it and plant it, how could Monsanto sue you for using it?
Well, they said that it does not matter how it gets into any farmer's field, and they specified just what I said before, cross-pollination, seed movement, and so on. And because they have a patent on one gene that makes that plant resistant, canola plant resistant to a chemical, then they own the ownership. So it doesn't matter how it gets to your field through patent law. They can take the whole total farmer's crop from him or make him destroyed. And in our case, my wife and I were seed developers in canola, which we had been doing for over 50 years, research in the development of disease control and so on. Even we lost all that research when the court ordered through patent law, they own it.
That Monsanto owned it?
That Monsanto owns it.
And how much did they fine you?
Well, initially they wanted so much an acre fine, but it ended up that they laid another lawsuit of $1 million against my wife and myself, and that also we had to fight. And besides that, there was another lawsuit in the 7 years before it went to the Supreme Court, where they tried to seize all our farmland. They tried to seize our home, our farm equipment, so they could stop us, because we were using mortgages on our farmland to pay for our legal bills.
And so then explain what happened. You appealed this right to the Canadian Supreme Court?
It went all the way. It went through the lower courts and Court of Appeal and so on, and then it went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. But there were other issues at the Supreme Court we could bring in that we could not bring in at the lower courts. First of all, farmers' rights to use their own seed from year to year to develop them, and then also the whole issue that we said in regards to patents, there should be no patents allowed on higher life forms, basically anything that comes from a seed. So that was one of the main things. We said to the Supreme Court that life is sacred. No one, no individual, no corporation should ever control it. You have to remember that in Canada, and I believe also in the United States, that there's nothing in our patent acts of 1867 and 1869 that there's talks about genes, because it was unknown at that time. So even at the present time, all these decisions are only decisions of the court and of a judge. And I should also mention that in the Supreme Court, it was a split decision, 5-4, where they ruled that Monsanto's patent on the gene is valid.
So they ruled against you or for you?
Against me.
At the Supreme Court?
The Supreme Court of Canada. But they also said that the whole issue of the patents on life has to go back to the Parliament of Canada to bring in laws and regulations in regards to the patents of seeds, plants, farmers' rights, and so on. And that's where it stands now.
So what happened to you?
Well, actually, what was it was actually a real victory for us, because the Supreme Court ruled we would not have to pay Monsanto no money. And the issue of the $1 million lawsuit, the issue of trying to seize our land and our farm equipment, our house and so on, and the whole issue that they could not have punitive damage against us and so on, was a major victory. But we thought it was over at that time. But little did we know that 2 years later, in 2005, we noticed that one of our fields, or we felt one of our fields were contaminated again with Monsanto's GMOs, and we notified Monsanto, and we did testing ourselves, and we were quite sure it was Monsanto's GMO canola in our field again. We notified Monsanto, and they said they would come out and check it, which we were surprised, and indeed 2 days later they came. Several days later, they notified us, yes, it is our GMO Monsanto's rapeseed in your field again. And they asked us what we wanted to have done with the contamination. We said to Monsanto, because we were starting to do research on mustard on that field, that we wanted every rapeseed, GMO rapeseed plant of Monsanto's pulled out by hand on this 50-acre field. And they agreed to do that. But here's the unusual part of it, and they do this to farmers across North America. They said, first of all, we'd have to sign a release form. And in this release form, it said my wife, myself, or any member of our family could never, ever take Monsanto to court again for the rest of our lives, no matter how much they contaminate us in the future on our land or on this farm. And we said there's no way we will ever do that. And the other thing in the release form, they said that our freedom of speech would be taken away. In other words, we could never ever talk what the terms of settlement were. I couldn't even talk to you here this morning. So we said to them, there's no way we're going to give up our freedom of speech. There's too many people in our countries, United States and Canada, have given our lives for the freedom of speech, and we'll never give it away to a corporation. Monsanto said if you don't sign the release, then we will not remove the offending plants, the GMO